and we're going to hear about a brief summary of the Chinese history by my twin sister again, Gail. Come on in, Gail!
So, I'm going to tell you about the history of Filipino-Chinese in the Philippines. Just a very brief history of Filipino-Chinese.
A brief history of Chinese Filipinos. It all started in the Han Dynasty, about 25 to 220 AD, when the Philippines was frequently mentioned in many government annals. During these centuries, traders from southern China exchanged their fabrics, porcelain, ware, metal products, and other goods with local beeswax, mother of pearl, bird's nest, raw silk. Along with the exchange of goods was also the exchange of cultures. Books about the Philippines circulated in China as early as the 10th century. Mostly travel books, they describe the lifestyles of the early Filipinos and their business procedures. Hua Pao, or Chinese Daily News, appeared in 1888, but because of the general illiteracy among these Chinese in the Philippines, it existed only for a year. Together with the appearance of Chinese newspapers was the founding of Chinese schools. Scholars from these schools edited and revised the content of newspapers to include literary pieces, mostly in the classical Chinese style, characterized by numerous allusions to Chinese history, elegant diction, strict observance of parallelism, and in poetry, rhythm, and rhyme. The 1930s were especially fruitful years for the Chinese writers in the Philippines. Literary magazines like Wei Ai, Only Love, Students' Literary Front, Tenma, Haifeng appeared, and many newspapers included literary sections. The growth of Chinese literature in the Philippines was halted by the invasion of the Japanese. But after the World War II, literature in Chinese was revived. The growth of Chinese Philippine literature in this period was brought about to a large extent by the establishment of Chinese Filipino Literature Workers Union in 1950. The years after the war marked the turning point in the Chinese Philippine literature. The writings produced during this period can be called truly Chinese Philippine. Till then, writings by the first generation Chinese in the Philippines were centered on China. The earliest works describe their loneliness in the Philippines, their longing to return to China, and their dreams for China. The 9 years of martial law was a dark time for Chinese Philippine literature. During these years, all Chinese publications were banned. Only the United Daily News was allowed. Chinese Philippine literature was almost dead until martial law was officially lifted in 1981. 5 Chinese newspapers resurfaced. The Philippinization of the Chinese schools began in the 1960s, produced Chinese Filipinos who could not read, speak, and write well in Chinese. Before the nationalization of foreign schools in 1960s, Chinese schools in the Philippines followed dual curriculums. The third generation writers were mostly in English and or Filipino because these are the languages they are better equipped in. Chinese Philippine literature in English is a relatively recent development. The oldest among Chinese Filipino writers in English were educated in the late 1960s and the 1970s, during which the Chinese language began to be supplanted as a first language for them by Filipino or English. They explore the problems of the Chinese Filipinos and their relations with other Filipinos.
So, Ash, did you hear about some issues of Chinese Filipinos?
Our field reporter, Rene, coming in.
Concerning the Chinese Filipino literature. One of the issues concerning the Chinese Filipino literature is the rampant criminality, such as the kidnapping of our Filipino Chinese friends and the accidental killing of our Filipino Chinese friends. However, kidnapping is said to be compounded by the highly visible role in the economic growth of our Chinese Filipino friends. They said that it is not merely a Chinese problem, but a social problem as well. Secondly, the problem of alienation is one of the problems of the Chinese Filipino literature. The lack of involvement in the Philippine politics. Kaisa was formed in order to make an effort of our Chinese Filipinos for the rights to citizenship, to freedom, and to equality. So back to you, Abby.
Thank you, Rene. So Caroline Howe wrote that what is disturbing about the kidnapping is not just the fact that the victims are mostly Chinese-Filipino, but the kidnapping and the responses to them both draw on an ethnic Chinese.
Yes, it's true. And the most persistent stereotype is the one that identifies Chinese with capital. Kidnapping itself gives us a stereotype about Chinese money as a very terrifying material embodiment. It treats the kidnapped victim itself as a commodity or in exchange for money. And that's so sad.
Let's hear the significance of Chinese-Filipino literature. The significance of Chinese-Filipino literature is Chinese-Filipino literature is significant since this literature is not just a literature of pure Chinese, but a literature of a pure Filipino. Tracing the history of this literature to Minondoan and the second significance of Chinese-Filipino, with some themes such as belongingness and hard work of Chinese-Filipino literature, is important for it shares applicable values that are relevant use to country's problems.
And that's all for today. Thank you for listening. We'll be back tomorrow. This is Chino